So given now we sort of get an understanding of who benefits from research, and I think we can understand that we can all benefit in our own way from research, is how can consumers impact research? The first way and the most traditional way is for somebody to become a research participant. And for many, many years, this was the only way that people with lived experience of spinal cord injury would actually be involved in the research cycle. And put simply, in that consumers influence research by providing data to studies. So if we were to look at this from a research cycle, so by this stage, that the researcher has identified the question, they've designed the study, consumers now, or participants, sorry, are then here in the data collecting stage. So in this instance, that the first two stages have been predetermined based on previous information or previous research, where the participant's role is purely in collecting the research. So then collecting the data, sorry. So then the data can be analyzed. So there's no real engagement with consumers in these first two areas, and none necessarily in the third as well, in the fourth as well, sorry. So purely as participants. The type of ways that people can be involved in participants are in clinical trials, focus groups, surveys, and interviews. So clinical trials provide researchers with an opportunity to trial their research into a new treatment or intervention on consumers. So as we spoke before about the types of research, they've established a problem. So in this case, a clinical problem. They then want to trial it to see if it works. So it's really at that sort of clinical research stage of, okay, we think this might work, we actually need to try it. Clinical trials seek to see if new treatment works, if the treatment is better than an existing or other treatments, and any side effects. That's really important as well. So there may be a medication, for example, for, let's say, spasticity that many people use, but it might not be completely effective or have some side effects. So then they've developed a new medication and they need to see if it is better or worse and what side effects they are. So that's a really important part. One of the common questions I get asked is how to get involved in clinical trials. Now, if you're in Australia, so this for an Australian audience, the Australian clinicaltrials.gov.au, if you search in there, you'll be able to find locally based clinical trials. But on a global level, there's SCItrials.org and SCItrialfinder.net. Now, all these links are on our SCI consumer website, so please feel free after the webinar, if you are interested, to go there. The second way is probably not as spoken about and not as thought of as types of, I guess, data collection in research is focus group or interviews. And these provide an opportunity to collect data in the form of personal lived experience or perspective. And this sort of information is called qualitative data. So it's a first-hand account. So asking a question and then providing a verbal response. And this really provides an opportunity to share a story. So as people with lived experience, even as therapists and clinicians, we have stories or lived or experiences that we can tell. And this provides an account on how we can do that, to the researcher on how that impacts us. So it's a verbal account, which a trial might not get. Another way of collecting data is surveys. And surveys the reason why surveys are quite effective is that they can detect if trends exist in large populations. If you ask, a large amount of people the same question, you can see how many people answer it a certain way. It's like, okay, and if your target group all have similar characteristics, so let's say if you were to ask, how many people with spinal cord injuries wake up and have a coffee in the morning, and you sort of think, well, we think some people do, some think don't. We ask a lot of people the same question, as long as they have the same characteristics, rather than asking a bunch of random people, we can then see what trends exist. And you might find a lot of people with spinal cord injuries drink coffee in the morning. And this is what's called as a quantitative data focus. So we're focusing on numbers and focusing on, how many people do this or how many people do that. It might be yes/no questions. It could provide a list of different responses, and we look for trends that way. And in this case, it still tells a story, but it's what story do the numbers tell? So basically, we're saying we want to try and gauge some information, but not so much in traditional story form, but more so in what story do the numbers tell? So, and make decisions based on trends and what have you. Another way for consumers, another role, sorry, for consumers to be involved in research is to actually be engaged in research, to sort of follow what's happening. So consumers need to keep up to date with relevant research that impacts their everyday life or practice. It ensures consumers that they make informed choices. So by keeping up to date with the latest research, your ability then to make decisions is backed by good information rather than, like sort of think this is a good idea and I'm not so much sure. So with people with lived experience or family members, this really impacts by actively seeking out evidence-based information to assist decision making. So let's say you want to go engage in an outpatient therapy practice. It's like, okay, well, is that practice based by research? What does the research say about it? And really ensuring that what you're doing is engaged. And that's really our role as well. And I'll elaborate that on a point a little bit later. For healthcare workers and community-based organisations, for people out there sort of watching this, and you're from one of those organisations, many of you may be already doing this, but it is important to remember that this is really an important part of practice, is that you need to ensure that your practice or project is backed by the latest research. So you may be doing running projects, and you may have great success with, let's say, participation in your projects. But how do you know that what you're doing is actually having the impact that you want? So you might take your project to a researcher and ask them the question to see if you're having the impact, or there may have research be already conducted that can help you benefit your practice. And that's a really important part and a really important role in where community organisations can take a lead. And once again, the benefit to people with spinal cord injuries is if that community-based organisations and healthcare workers are keeping up to date with research, the end user, the people with spinal cord injuries, as well as the family members, benefit from that. I'm often asked, where can we find information on spinal research? And it can be really, really difficult to navigate. A lot of people do jump on Google as well. But if you're going to jump on Google, maybe try Google Scholar. So that actually bring up academic publications as well as government publications. So you're more likely to get information that is relevant, for example. Government websites. So governments do a lot of research and they fund a lot of research, and part of their obligation is then to publish that research. And so, for example, if you're in Australia, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare publish a lot of data on spinal cord injuries, disability, things like the health department, and a lot of governments around the world. So in the UK, the NIH and what have you do that as well. And so governments can be really proactive, and generally their obligation is to make sure that what they're sharing is research-based. Journals and publications as well. So traditionally researchers, this is where they're sharing their work, and it's really important for them in their research cycle to get their work out in that way. These can be really hard once again. So even through sort of Google Scholar and through journal publications, it can be hard to access. But in Victoria, for example, you can access these information, a lot of this information through the state library, and you're able to join that as a member. And a lot of libraries and what have you, you can get information through their membership as well. Another way is generally through scientific meetings and conferences. So if you're a community-based healthcare worker, or if you're a community-based organization, this may be the opportunity for you to go engage with researchers or meet with researchers or network. I'm also an advocate for people with lived experience attending these as well. Even though you might not be a researcher per se, or involved in it, definitely by going and watching, you can then engage with them and you sort of do your own networking, but that way you're able to keep up to date with the research that's going on as well. And research-backed organizations, so this is quite broad as well. So there are a lot of organizations out there that share a lot of data, but they actually, there's a research component to their work. So organizations like Praxis in Canada, as well as sort of Christopher Reid Foundation and what have you, those sort of spinal organizations, they sharing work based on research. So they're not just sharing generic answers or sharing information that doesn't have any benefit. They're sharing work that is actually backed by research. And generally you can pick that up on their website. If you go on a website, you can sort of see that, is it an opinion piece? So are they sharing opinions, or are they sharing data? And basically looking, they'll have things like a lot of statistics and a lot of sort of, numbers and what have you on their pages. So you're able to pick that up pretty quickly in the type of information they share. A really valuable resource that I think that could be utilized more, especially by myself, that I never really knew about this until too often, was the SCIREproject.com. And basically they have a website for professionals as well as people with lived experience. So they have two sort of aspects. They have SCIRE Professional and SCIRE Community, where they update their website to keep up to date with the latest trends in research. And you can go on their site and they've got all these different lists, and it includes things like bowel management, spasticity, stem cells, and basically they update it to keep up to date with the latest research. So once again, there is a link to this on our SRI website. So please feel free after the webinar or in your own time to go and check that out as well. So another role that's really important is consumers need to drive research outcomes. So as people with lived experience, as family members, as well as clinicians, we need to be the really driving the outcomes. We need to be the ones pushing for change in a lot of ways. So I spoke before about identifying the research question, and the traditional role for consumers is here in sort of this stage of research collecting data. So really as research participants, where what this really involves is having consumers in identifying the research question, as well as designing the study. So basically, we want to shift the thinking from consumers or people with lived experience conducting the research, participants, into actually helping designing the study. Obviously, we still need people with lived experience to be involved as participants, but the main thing is the shift of thinking into identifying the question. So if we think of the benefits of that, so if we look at all these challenges, so we've put these up before, is that different people have different perspectives on this. So a researcher might understand the theory and understand the literature on pain management or spasms, but not have that lived experience, not have that understanding. And when you're shaping a question, or in particular shaping a methodology around how to answer that question, getting that lived experience point of view makes the study more relevant. And the reason why to think about this as a broader SCI community issue as well. So if we look at rehabilitation, for example, so there is multiple different aspects and multiple different participants in the rehabilitation process. So the person with lived experience who has their actual experience of going through the rehabilitation process, and they understand what worked, what didn't. It was very individual for them, also individual to where they do their rehabilitation. Then you've got the family member process. So their understanding of what it was like as a family member to go through rehabilitation. Then we have, and some of you may be here today, the nursing staff, the medical staff, and their understanding of, although they don't have a lived experience of spinal cord injury, their understanding of, well, this seems to work, or over 10, 15 years of being a nurse or a doctor, I've developed this understanding. But then there's also therapists, so exercise physiologists and physiotherapists and occupational therapists, for example, and their understanding. So across all these challenges, there's all these different perspectives. So we're then going from identifying what the challenges are to trying to develop an understanding of how to best address these challenges. So then if we take these challenges and all the different perspectives associated with those challenges, plug them into the research cycle, and once again, bring in all that information to shape the question, to identify a method, and then that ideally brings forward consumer-focused outcomes. So, for example, a person with SCI may have a perspective on spasticity and understand that, well, this medication might work, this medication doesn't work. For example, the type of medication as well. Would they prefer a slow release? Would they prefer something that they can take that works a lot quicker? They identify that challenge. They work with a researcher to shape a question around, well, this is what I think works. This is my experience of actually doing it. So taking that, plugging that into the research cycle. So then, okay, going through that, but then through the process of, all right, let's look at a methodology that we can test something that's better. And hopefully the outcome of that would be to develop a spasm strategy that is more focused on helping people live experience. So that's how that research can then shape the way things are done. An example of this on the large scale, so we spoke about surveys and we spoke about looking at trends, was a survey conducted in 2004 by Kim Anderson. Kim Anderson as well is herself a person with lived experience of spinal cord injury. So that's really the ultimate in engagement, where you have a person with spinal cord injury actually conducting and leading the research. So she did a survey of priorities of people with spinal cord injury. So as we said before, a survey is a great way to identify trends across this, a community. But what did the story tell? So in her survey, basically, the trend was that amongst quadriplegics and people like myself, regaining hand function was really, really a priority. For paraplegics, it was regaining sexual function. And across both trends, or both groups, sorry, the trend was bladder and bowel. And there are, I would really encourage people to go read this survey, or read this study, because it's quite an interesting perspective. So what's the impact? So this might be a lot of stuff. So people like us and who are watching this web might go, well, we know a lot of this. So we understand what this information is because we've lived with it. We've had clients that have dealt with this. Sorry. But what's the impact? The impact isn't the information necessarily for us because we live with it, but it's taking this information to researchers that are setting questions and basically saying, okay, well, these are the priorities. You should allocate your funding and your resources to this. And it really then targets the areas. So rather than researchers working on areas that are important, but don't necessarily have the market, the consumer-driven emphasis on it. So then the resources are allocated. So change is made in the right areas. So that's the value of an example of way that consumers can drive research outcomes. And that's another reason, another important reason as well, that consumers really need to be involved in things like surveys and focus groups, because it provides this sort of data. Although this isn't a medical intervention, so there isn't anything out of this particular survey that's going to create a pill or a different practice. It may in the long term, because that's where the resources are then allocated. This really leads into the notion and the term, and many of you have heard, that there's no decision about us without us. So, as we spoke before, traditionally, people with spinal cord injuries have only been really involved as participants in research. So really only in that sort of latter stage of research. But that's not where the decision making is made, or the actual process of research occurs. So we really need to be active and ensure that we are involved in the decision making when it comes to research. Spoke before about driving it. So the term PLEX is person with lived experience. So how can people with lived experience drive research? And I'm really thinking sort of on a broader level, and something simple that we can do is that as people with lived experience, we can be asking our therapists if their practice, is backed by research, and thinking, okay, well, I may already do this, or I don't, or I might assume that they do this. So what's the actual impact of this? What is the actual flow on effect of this? And if we think about it, once again, think about the beneficiary. So that's a person with lived experience. I go to a therapist, or I might be engaging with a therapist, and I might ask them, so is your practice, let's say they're a physiotherapist. So I go to a physiotherapist, like, look, is your practice up to date with the best spinal cord injury research? And they might say yes, and they might say no. If they're saying no, well, then it's up to me as a person with lived experience. So, well, do I really want to engage with that person? Do I want to work with somebody, or have somebody work with me that is not engaged in best practice? So then ideally the physiotherapist is like, well, maybe I need to engage in research. Then I'm not alienating a market group. So then, but the flow-on effect is that the researcher, that physiotherapist, may be like, well, I need to go away and I need to actually do some research. And am I best engaged? So then as a person with a spinal cord injury asking that question, the flow-on effect is, well, the person that you've asked actually starts thinking about that and says, well, maybe I'm not up to date, or they do go away and work on finding some research that benefits them, and then they may have questions that they then ask researchers or what have you. So the flow-on effect really starts with us, and it's something as simple as, is your practice or is your program backed by research, or asking why they do something. So why do you do this technique? It's like, oh, if they say, well, I've always done this and I know that it works, it's like, well, what's the anecdotal evidence behind that? And another really important thing, and we are coming up to our question time as well. So if you do have any questions or conversations that you want to start, please feel free to put that in the chat as well. Is that consumers and researchers, the next part, and the most important part potentially, is that consumers and researchers are partners in research. So we spoke about, this is really an evolution of beginning as participants, then helping shape research. But I guess the end goal is really that consumers and researchers are partners in research. And what does that mean? So if we think about it traditionally, so consumers and the research community, we're sort of working towards the same goal, but sort of looking at it differently. So consumers always have their point of view on what they believe, and then the research community sort of thinking, okay, and once again, the research community were probably asking a lot of questions or making a lot of the decisions that weren't, not that they weren't beneficial, but they weren't having the impact on consumers, or asking questions that they were perceived, that they perceived to have the impact on the community. We need to change this thinking to where consumers and researchers are working together, and not necessarily with one opinion being better than the other, but sharing their opinion. So consumers and researchers then partnering to ensure that research is being done, and it's not so much separate communities. So if we look at that visually, so if we take the research cycle and all the aspects, so consumers and researchers are both having a contributing and a say, in all these areas. So once again, working together to identify the research question. So the researchers' benefit is they have the ability to do, I guess, the background and what have you. The consumers are providing input into what is a relevant question and why that is relevant. So it's really what is the impact of the question, and that's the big thing. Design in a study and methodology, once again, that we spoke a bit about this, but they should be partnership. So something as simple as, if a researcher is asking in developing their method, it's like, well, we're going to do this, but what happens if it isn't suitable for, let's say a high-level quadriplegic to be out of bed at 9 o'clock in the morning and to be somewhere at 9 o'clock in the morning that's halfway across town. So actually in developing a method that is suitable and accessible for people, because research should be accessible once again, and that then impacts on collecting the data. Collecting the data. An area where consumers and researchers can really benefit, in my opinion, is in the analysis of the data. So we spoke before about what story does research tell, or what is it, or what trends is there. A researcher will look at data and they'll see it as data. It's like, well, this many people said this, many people did say that, and they'll analyze it from a perspective of a researcher, and not necessarily try and develop an understanding, or they are trying to develop an understanding, but they may not understand why. Where a consumer will look at something and a researcher might say, well, this many people do this. And a consumer might have that answer because they may do it themselves, or an answer, well, I do this because of this reason. And obviously sharing the findings. So the reason this is really important in partnership is that the idea of essentially is that for research to be translated to consumers, so people that are actively involved, if they're working together in partnership, the findings are sort of automatically shared with that community. So the importance of partnership is it really utilizes the knowledge of consumers with the skill set of researchers. So you're really taking the two different knowledge bases of the two different groups and bringing them together. And to the point before, that SCIRE research is meaningful and relevant. So the questions that are getting answered directly address the challenges that are faced. We spoke together about the puzzle, and it's bringing each individual bit of the puzzle together as well. So an overview. So consumers from the broader SCIRE community play a vital role in influencing and driving research. And through sharing our stories of SCIRE, we can enhance the quality of life. So that's really important as well. So by sharing our experience, but sharing it with researchers, so people with the ability to create change, we can actually enhance the quality of life, not just for us, but for other people with spinal cord injuries as well.